From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Climate strike led by our children is a wake-up call to all political and business leaders that we are running out of time. We need to act with urgency.
As more than 1 million students prepare to walk out of class Friday in a global climate strike, we speak to Kumi Naidoo, Secretary General of Amnesty International. He's urging schools across the globe to allow students to skip class without facing punishment. Then to the African nation of Gambia, where an ongoing Public Truth and Reconciliation Commission is investigating the atrocities of former dictator Yahya Jammeh. We'll speak to a Gambian beauty queen who has publicly accused Jammeh of rape.
Nobody discusses rape. And yes, I am scared. I am scared. But I want the next person after me to be a little less scared than me.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is blaming Iran for last weekend's attacks on Saudi oil facilities, describing them as an act of war. Pompeo was speaking from Jeddah, where he met with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to discuss the attacks, which left heavily damaged one of the world's biggest oil processing facilities. Pompeo's visit came as Saudi military officials in Riyadh showed reporters remnants of what they described as Iranian drones and cruise missiles, saying they could not have been launched by Yemen's Houthi rebels, even though Houthis have claimed responsibility for the attacks. Iran's denied responsibility, but Foreign Minister Javad Zarif told CNN his nation's prepared to defend itself against any attack by the U.S. or its allies.
What would be the consequence of an American or a Saudi military strike on Iran now?
An all-out war.
You make a very serious statement there, sir.
Well, I make a very serious statement about defending our country. I'm making a very serious statement that we don't want war. We don't want to engage in a military confrontation. We believe that a military confrontation based on deception is awful. We'll have a lot of casualties, but we won't blink to defend our territory.
Senate Democrats have warned Trump against any attack on Iran, saying he would need authorization from Congress. President Trump said Wednesday he's imposed new sanctions on Iran, though the White House Treasury and State Department haven't released any details. The Washington Post reports a conversation between President Trump and a world leader disturbed a U.S. intelligence official so much that the person filed a whistleblower complaint, leading to a showdown between lawmakers and U.S. intelligence agencies. According to the Washington Post, Trump's interaction with the foreign leader included a promise that was regarded as so troubling that it prompted the unnamed official to file a complaint with Michael Atkinson, the Inspector General of the intelligence community. Atkinson reportedly agreed the concern was credible and troubling enough to alert congressional oversight committees, but Acting Director of National Intelligence Joseph McGuire has refused to share details of the complaint with lawmakers. Atkinson is scheduled to answer questions in a closed-door session of the House Intelligence Committee today. It's not clear which world leader's conversation with Trump prompted the complaint. The Post reports Trump spoke with 5 world leaders during the time period covered, including Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. President Trump has named Robert O'Brien as his 4th national security advisor after ousting John Bolton from the role last week. O'Brien's the author of the 2016 book While America Slept, Restoring American Leadership to a World in Crisis, a collection of essays promoting hawkish U.S. foreign policy. O'Brien's a longtime associate of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, previously served as the top U.S. hostage negotiator. In July, President Trump sent O'Brien to Sweden to win the release of ASAP Rocky after the 30-year-old rapper's arrest for allegedly assaulting a 19-year-old man in Stockholm. He's previously worked as a national security advisor to the presidential campaigns of Republican candidates Ted Cruz, Scott Walker, and Mitt Romney. In Afghanistan, in the lead-up to national elections later this month, at least 30 civilians were killed and 40 wounded late Wednesday after U.S.-backed Afghan security forces launched an air raid on farmers in eastern Nangarhar province. A local official said a drone attack was aimed at a hideout used by Islamic State fighters, but instead killed farm workers who'd finished a hard day's labor harvesting pine nuts. Elsewhere, the Taliban has claimed responsibility for a truck bomb explosion in the southern city of Kalat that killed at least 20 people and wounded 97 others. A local official said the blast ripped through a gate to a hospital, but the target was likely a nearby training base for Afghanistan's powerful security agency. Elsewhere in eastern Afghanistan, a suicide bomber and gunmen attacked a government building in Jalalabad, injuring at least 9 people at a distribution center for national identity cards, which voters will need to cast ballots in the September 28th election. This follows a pair of attacks on Tuesday that killed 48 and wounded dozens of others. The Taliban promised to step up attacks after President Trump abruptly canceled peace talks on September 7th, declaring the negotiations dead. In Indonesia, massive forest fires have spread toxic haze over the islands of Sumatra and Borneo, sending residents to hospitals, shutting down airports, and closing schools as far away as Singapore and Malaysia. On Wednesday, military pilots began seeding clouds above the fires with chemicals, hoping to produce enough rain to douse the blazes. Indonesian officials estimate about 80% of the fires were deliberately set in order to clear land for palm oil plantations. In Bermuda, more than 28,000 homes and businesses lost power overnight as the outer bands of Hurricane Humberto brought down trees and power lines, but the British territory was spared a direct hit from the dangerous Category 3 hurricane. This comes as a record-tying 6 named storms churned in the eastern Pacific and Atlantic basins. Climate scientists say warmer ocean temperatures driven by greenhouse gas emissions are making hurricanes and other extreme weather events more destructive. On Capitol Hill, Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg pleaded with a congressional committee Wednesday to listen to climate scientists' warnings about catastrophic climate change. In a short opening statement, the 16-year-old youth climate leader said she was not submitting testimony, but it would instead enter a report by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change into the congressional record. The report calls on world leaders to take rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented action to avert a climate catastrophe.
I am submitting this report as my testimony because I don't want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to the scientists. And I want you to unite behind the science. And then I want you to take real action.
More than 1 million students are expected to walk out of classes in over 150 countries Friday in a global climate strike, with more than 800 actions in the United States alone. Youth leaders are also billing Friday's strike as a day of action for Puerto Rico. September 20th marks the 2-year anniversary of Hurricane Maria's landfall on the island, which led to thousands of deaths, destroying homes and businesses and knocking out electricity for months. We'll have more on the climate crisis after headlines with Kumi Naidu, Amnesty International Secretary General. The University of California has voted to divest from fossil fuel companies. Writing in the Los Angeles Times, 2 top university investment officials said it was the long-term risk posed by fossil fuel investments rather than concerns over the environment that have led them to pull some $150 million in fossil fuel assets from the university endowment. Nonetheless, climate activists are hailing the move. 350.org founder Bill McKibben tweeted, "The presidents of Harvard, Yale, Stanford, the University of Michigan, and others should follow suit," adding, "If the biggest system in the country has decided it must sell its oil stock, the pressure on these guys will go way up," McKibben said. In Israel, the party of election challenger Benny Gantz has rejected an offer from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to join him in a unity government. Netanyahu's surprise offer came after Tuesday's election provided no clear winner. Both Netanyahu and Gantz ran on platforms vowing to take harsh measures targeting Palestinians and have called on Israel to annex much of the occupied West Bank in violation of international law. In Japan, a court has found 3 former executives at the Tokyo Electric Power Company not guilty of professional negligence over their role in the multiple nuclear meltdowns at the Fukushima power plant in 2011. The 3 had been indicted for failing to safeguard against the magnitude 9 earthquake and tsunami that brought power at the nuclear plant offline, leading to explosions that spread radioactive fallout over parts of northern Japan. They were the only people to face criminal charges for the nuclear disaster. Back in the United States, Democratic Party donor and political activist Ed Buck was arrested in Los Angeles Tuesday night and charged with several felonies, including running a drug house following the overdose deaths of at least 2 black gay men at Buck's home in the past 2 years. Buck's arrest comes after a 3rd man overdosed on methamphetamine at Buck's apartment last week. The man survived. Black LGBTQ activists and the family members of the 2 men who've died in Buck's house have been calling on prosecutors for months to file criminal charges against him, accusing him of being a sexual predator. If convicted, Buck faces a maximum of 5 years in prison. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau apologized Wednesday after a photo emerged showing him in brownface. The 2001 photo, published by Time magazine, was taken from a Vancouver high school yearbook where Trudeau was then a teacher. It shows him wearing a costume turban with his face and hands covered with dark makeup. Speaking to journalists Wednesday, Trudeau said he dressed up as Aladdin as part of an Arabian Nights-themed school gala.
I take responsibility for my decision to do that. I shouldn't have done it. I should have known better. It was something that I didn't think was racist at the time, but now I recognize it was something racist to do, and I am deeply sorry.
The photo's publication comes just 1 week after Prime Minister Trudeau launched his re-election campaign. It drew condemnation from leaders of all of Canada's political parties. This is Jagmeet Singh, leader of the New Democratic Party.
Well, it's troubling. I mean, it's insulting. Anytime we hear examples of brown-face or black-facing, it's making a mockery of someone for what they live and what the lived experiences are. I think he needs to answer for it. I think he's got to answer the question why he did that.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. More than 1 million students around the world are expected to walk out of class on Friday in a global climate strike. More than 800 climate strikes are scheduled in the United States. Strikes are also being organized in 150 other countries. On Wednesday, 16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, who inspired the movement, testified before the U.S. Congress.
My name is Greta Thunberg. I have not come to offer any prepared remarks at this hearing. I'm instead attaching my testimony. It is the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the SR 1.5, which was released on October 8, 2018. I am submitting this report as my testimony because I don't want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to the scientists. And I want you to unite behind the science. And then I want you to take real action. Thank you.
Amnesty International's Secretary General Kumi Naidoo has urged school districts across the globe to allow students to skip school Friday without facing punishment. In an open letter to school leaders, Naidoo recently wrote, quote, "Children should not be punished for speaking out about the great injustices of our age. In fact, when it's fallen on young people to show the leadership that many adults who hold great positions of power have failed to, it is not young people's behavior we should be questioning. It is ours," he said. Kumi Naidoo joins us now in our New York studio. He became the Secretary General of Amnesty International a year ago. He previously served as the International Executive Director of Greenpeace and was also involved in the anti-apartheid movement in his home country of South Africa, where he was also kicked out of school for protesting. Kumi Naidoo, it's great to have you back. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you very much, Amy. It's good to be here.
So it's interesting, your titles, where you have been. Now you're at Amnesty International. You're the head of it. You were at the head of Greenpeace, and you are here in New York. You'll be part of the global climate strike, but you're also at this unprecedented meeting of environmentalists and human rights activists pulling together all of your activism in your life.
I think one of the catastrophic mistakes we made in 1992 when the Rio Earth Summit happened was framing our response to the threat of climate change solely or primarily as an environmental issue. I think we needed to have done then what we are trying to do now. It's late, but better late than never, which is to ensure that we bring a cross-cutting understanding of climate change and bring a more human-centric approach to addressing climate change. So the summit that we're having is primarily non-environmental activism coming together and asking ourselves the question, what can the human rights movement bring to ensuring there's an urgency on the climate question? Because basically climate change today constitutes a mass death penalty on the entire population of our planet.
Could you talk about that a little bit more? Who are the populations that are most affected?
Well, the sad reality is that the people that are paying the first and most brutal impacts of climate change are those that actually have been the least responsible for it. So these are people in Mozambique, where we saw, I grew up in Southern Africa, that's my home. I don't have any recollection of cyclones ever. And then Mozambique has 2 cyclones in 2 weeks, wiping out almost an entire city with hundreds of people's lives being devastated and lost. But if we look at it, the disproportional effect of the impacts is still very much, it's not as if there's no impacts in rich countries, there is, but in comparative terms, it is the poor countries that are suffering. Yesterday, in my opening address to the climate summit, the People Summit, I said, just because it's not yet, in the north, you can be assured it's coming to a theater near you quite soon. And the reality is that we have to get this right as rich and poor countries acting together, and we secure the future of all our children and their children. If we continue to be as divided as we are, true, people in poor countries unfairly are paying the first price, but people in rich countries need to know that they are not sanitized on a long-term basis from the impacts of climate change.
But it seems, in fact, that the differential impact is not just now between rich and poor countries, but also between the rich and poor within countries. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights earlier this year warned that the unequal distribution of these impacts could lead to climate apartheid, whereby, quote, he said, the wealthy pay to escape overheating, hunger and conflict, while the rest of the world is left to suffer. Could you say a little about the ways in which you see both wealthy countries and the wealthy within all countries kind of shielding themselves from the worst effects, and how so many people are left out of that?
Absolutely. I mean, when we think about the climate crisis, you can think about the sinking of the Titanic, right? Everybody in the Titanic, when it struck that iceberg, was under threat. But we know that based on your wealth, you had a different opportunity of succeeding or not. Even in the United States, if you look at Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the wealthier folks were able to jump in the cars and drive away. Poorer folks were left stranded in hospitals, in prisons, in communities, and so on. So when we look at this challenge, we need to recognize that climate change is also, at its heart, one of the biggest problems is our consumption patterns, our how the material benefits of the world are distributed. And the bottom line is, if we do not address, as part of our climate solution, deep structural inequality that exists in the world, we're never going to get to a place of really addressing climate on the long-term basis. There is no question that those of us who are at the top end of society, who actually lead lives of overconsumption, need to recognize that the poor are actually subsidizing our lifestyle by the pain that they have to take. And this is an uncomfortable, thing to accept. There are a lot of well-meaning people around the world say how they are opposed to poverty and so on. But we need to understand that the scale of poverty, inequality, and therefore unsustainability practices is there because a relatively handful of people in the world insist on living a particular lifestyle which is actually so unequal and so indefensible. So yes, we need to understand this problem is between rich and poor countries, but also within individual countries.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. After Kumi Naidoo, Secretary General of Amnesty International, we'll be joined by the Gambian beauty queen who says she was raped by the former dictator. We'll talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is going there now and her bravery in saying she will return to confront him. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with Kumi Naidoo in a minute. Rain Song by Imago. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guest is Kumi Naidoo, Secretary General of Amnesty International, previously the head of Greenpeace and longtime South African anti-apartheid and climate justice activist, the first African to lead Greenpeace. So you're here in New York. Can you talk about the climate strike that youth are leading on Friday? Tomorrow we'll have a roundtable of youth discussing this, walking out of school. It's something you know well from anti-apartheid days in South Africa.
Well, yeah. I mean, I walked out of school when I was 15. It's a little bit of deja vu, but let me just say these kids are much more smarter, much more strategic, much more
you got
sort of
thrown
networked. Yeah, I, together with thousands, were expelled from school for that reason.
And you were 15 years old.
Yeah, I was 15. But
and so you've asked now schools around the world to do the opposite.
Yeah, and you know, I would argue that my act, together with my fellow young people in South Africa at that time, was actually an educative act. We learned actually from being part of trying to shape the history of our country. These young people are shaping the history of the world. Democracy Now!, as you know, has been covering climate activism for a long time intensively. I'm sure you'll agree with me that this is the most powerful, energizing moment in our struggle on climate catastrophe. And I think that while on the one hand we're facing a situation where we are so close to the cliff because we're running out of time, on the other hand, I think the young kids have actually shown courage. And I wrote to principals and teachers and so on, just saying, you know, not to punish kids for doing what their parents should be doing and what political and business leaders should be doing. The reality is the kids are behaving like adults, and some of our politicians, including the guy that sits in the White House, are behaving like spoiled brats.
And by the way, the kids are saying that all people should walk out and should not just be children,
Sure.
work out of their workplaces, come from home to join in the streets.
Yes, and I have to tell you, you've been using a figure of 1 million people or more than 1 million. I am cautiously optimistic that this is going to be the largest climate protest and potentially one of the largest protests ever to happen in the world. We yesterday, in terms of the website, almost the double number of events were registered within 48 hours. There is a momentum that is picking up, and I hope that parents in particular will honor their children. Those parents that are able to participate and join wherever they are in the world, we encourage them to do that, because what is at stake here is not saving the planet. It's actually securing our children and their children's future, and therefore it's right that children are in the front line when their politicians are not willing to protect their futures.
Well, I mean, even as obviously these young people and many other climate justice activists are rising up as the ones who can potentially bring leaders and, as you say, parents around to understanding how huge this climate crisis is, there's also an unprecedented attack on climate and environmental activists. Earlier this month, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet condemned the increasing attacks on climate activists, including, in fact, Greta Thunberg. This is a clip.
The Office and Special Rapporteurs have noted attacks on environmental human rights defenders in virtually every region, particularly in Latin America. I am disheartened by this violence and also by the verbal attacks on young activists such as Greta Thunberg and others who galvanize support for prevention of the harm their generation may bear. The demands made by environmental defenders and activists are compelling, and we should respect, protect, and fulfill their rights.
So that's the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Kumi, could you talk about what's happening to climate activists around the world?
Well, actually, this is exactly the conversation we had with the UN Secretary General yesterday, where we pointed out to him that according to Global Witness, last year, for example, every week, 3 environmental activists on average were murdered, right? Most of them every week. By the way, the statistic in previous years, for the last several years, was 2 per week. It spiked since the Bolsonaro election, for example. And in Brazil. So what we see, it's global, that's a global average, but there's a disproportionate number of people being killed in the Amazonian area and in Latin America. But it's important that we recognize that the repression is not only about murder, but the attacks in terms of online attacks. In terms of online attacks, as a report by Amnesty International last year showed, if you take Twitter, for example, there's a disproportional level of abuse against women and a disproportional level of abuse against women of color. And now we are seeing that young people are particularly also in the front line of this attacks by usually politicians, the handful that are still denying the climate science.
Let's talk about the destruction of the Amazon, the world's largest rainforest. The United Nations calling for the protection of the Amazon amidst fears that thousands of fires raging across Brazil are paving the way for a climate catastrophe. Environmentalists say most of the fires were deliberately set by illegal miners and cattle ranchers. Meanwhile, as the fires continue to rage, the far-right Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has pinned blame on non-governmental organizations.
Regarding the fires in the Amazon, I'm under the impression that it could have been set by the NGOs because they had asked for money. What was their intention? To bring about problems for Brazil.
And then I want to turn to an indigenous activist, Artemisa Barbosa Ribeiro, an indigenous activist from Brazil who traveled to the U.S. from Brazil for Friday's climate strike actions.
Meu território no Brasil fica no Cerrado.
My territory in Brazil is in the dry highlands of the Cerrado. Even the young can see this highland disappearing, and our native plants are dying due to lack of water. If it goes on like this, 20 years from now, my homeland will become a desert. My people will be at risk of becoming history. Right now, the Amazon, home to millions of my relatives, is burning.
So that's Aramisa Barbosa Ribera, and she was there in Washington, D.C. at a news conference standing next to Senator Markey and Greta Thunberg and others. Very important as we bring the power quote from Bolsonaro, but also the elevation of the voices of these indigenous activists and how much threat they face. When the Amazon is on fire, you look at the maps, their areas that they protect are not on fire when you look at the map from above. And the other areas are the ones on fire, the threats that you've been continuing to talk about, Kumi.
Well, one of the key points that came out of the first day of the People's Summit was that we owe a major debt to indigenous peoples around the world. It is sad that we didn't listen to their wisdoms about how humanity should coexist with nature in a mutually interdependent relationship. Had we seen how that indigenous knowledge has actually saved parts of the Amazon, as you say, and right now we actually need indigenous knowledge in the global conversation around addressing climate catastrophe moving forward, because there is a deep intelligence and history about how we live in a more sustainable way with resources that humanity needs for our water, for our soil, for our food production, and so on. The reality is there are rich countries in the world who historically completely chopped down their forests, like in Europe and so on, to develop themselves. And so what Bolsonaro does is uses a range of false narratives to actually sort of say, well, oh, those people chop the forest, therefore we should do the same. That's ridiculous. Brazil and the other countries around Brazil where the Amazon sits are people who are the possessors and the holders of the most precious global asset, their natural asset, one of the most. And that value is gone once you chop it down. And that is why in the climate negotiations, for example, we say that we want significant resources to go in a green climate fund so that countries can be supported, as Indonesia was supported previously, with serious support from Norway, not to further deforest by getting a big support to actually cover whatever they might have lost economically.
They have the second largest rainforest in Indonesia.
And Kumi, if you could just give us a sense, you've obviously participated in climate negotiations for a very long time, first at Greenpeace, and now you're still involved at Amnesty. We've been talking about Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and obviously Trump here in the United States, who actually raises questions about whether climate science is accurate. China, meanwhile, is reportedly planning to use funds intended to support clean energy to fund so-called clean coal instead. I mean, these are major countries that are responsible for large amounts of emissions. If you could give us a sense of where they stand, big polluters, how does this compare to other countries around the world? I mean, Greta Thunberg, one of the points that she made when she came, is that the conversation in Sweden is so radically different than from here. And what can be done about the fact that the heads of state of these large countries responsible for the majority of emissions are not doing what's required?
I think it's scandalous, it's irresponsible, and it's shameful, because I give you, in Africa, Morocco and Gambia, where our sister who you're going to interview comes from, these are two countries that are basically on track to fulfill 1.5 degree sort of obligations. We are seeing other poor countries making a lot of effort, but we can do everything in smaller countries, but if the big countries who are the biggest emitters don't change radically now, then these emissions don't respect boundaries, right? They are up there in the atmosphere, and it's going to impact on everybody. So the lack of urgency, I think, has to be named as a mental condition that our political leaders are facing, which is a cognitive dissonance.
Political leaders saying it's too expensive in the wealthiest countries, and then you have the poorest countries taking major steps to address climate change. In July, volunteers in Ethiopia planted 350 million trees in 12 hours. As part of a national campaign to tackle the climate crisis. 80% of Ethiopia's population depends on agriculture for its livelihood, but Ethiopia suffers from soil erosion, deforestation, flooding, and harsh drought conditions. A study released earlier this year found that planting 1.2 trillion trees could cancel out 10 years of carbon dioxide emissions. Meanwhile, England has fallen over 70% short of its government targeting for tree planting.
Absolutely. The Ethiopia tree planting versus the UK tree planting example tells you that it's a question of political will. And our leaders need to now understand that nature does not negotiate. You cannot change the science. All that we can change right now is political will. And thankfully, political will is a renewable resource, if you know what I mean. And so citizens now need to be asking, as citizens around the world are asking in different countries, how are their leaders going to act on climate? You might remember 5 years ago, we were not getting that kind of bottom-up pressure on our political leaders to act on climate. Now, even in the United States, a majority of citizens are saying they want climate action. So I think right now we must ask the question, why are our political leaders not acting? We got popular opinion behind them. The reason is very clear. There are people in the current energy system, in the current economic system that are making truckloads of money every second of every day that are going to defend the system until it kills our children and their futures. And that is why we have to take on the collusion between the fossil fuel industry and governments, because too many governments have been captured and bought off by the fossil fuel industry and other polluting industries.
As you know, also, Kumi, one of the issues that is repeatedly pointed to in discussions about climate change is population growth. And of course, the countries where the population is growing are largely developing countries, and it's in Europe and North America where birth rates have gone down. But I want you to comment on the differences between consumption levels of people who live in the North and people who live in the global South. A recent report found that the average American generates the same amount of carbon dioxide emissions as 583 people would in Burundi. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, the number is even greater. Carbon dioxide emissions for an average Saudi resident is the same amount as 719 people in Burundi.
So let us first say that it is an important question for us to talk about population growth in an intelligent, informed way. I think that there is a simple strategy, which the women's movement has told us multiple times, to address the question of rapid population growth and unsustainable population growth, and that is just give us full gender equality. If we have full gender equality, we have seen where gender equality levels picks up, family sizes go down, right? So to all the politicians in the world and all those that are concerned about population growth, become a gender activist now and push for 100% gender equality. And I think, given where the resources in the world are right now, it is a sensible thing for us to check population growth. However, having said that, that statistic is absolutely right, of course. I've been quoting this, different versions of it over time, to make the point that, you know, the unequal consumption in the world is what's driving this problem. And unless we also begin to understand what constitutes a happy, meaningful life, and we have to break this idea that happiness comes from more and more and more and more consumption, because that it clearly is not what gives you happiness in a meaningful
We just
identity.
have 30 seconds. The climate strike is Friday, Saturday, UN Youth Summit at the United Nations, and on Monday, the 23rd, the UN Climate Action Summit, before the big one in Santiago, Chile, where, of course, we'll be in December. That one on Monday, what are you expecting out of it? What do you want to see come out of it? What did Guterres say to you yesterday when you met with him, the UN Secretary General, meeting with the Secretary General of Amnesty?
So the good thing that the Secretary General did for the summit, he said, each country gets, head of state gets 3 minutes, but you're not coming here to give a speech about the problem. You're only coming here to announce your plans. And therefore, Japan, Australia, my country, South Africa as well, they're not speaking, because they're coming to talk about, they're continuing with coal, for example.
The U.S.?
No, South Africa.
I know,
well,
but the
US is not there because they haven't signed they've pulled out of the Paris Accord. I mean, that's like a no-brainer, sadly. So what we have is a Secretary General at the moment on climate is pushing really hard. We hope governments actually catch up with ways trying to take them to go, and the proof of the pudding will be there on Monday. Having said that, as we said before we went to the Paris Agreement, we didn't say road to Paris, we said road through Paris. And so all of these moments, yes, they're important, but it's yappity, yappity, yap, right? As Greta and this young kids are saying, time for talking is over. So our political and business leaders must hear from the People Summit that's taking place and multiple other conversations. We are not going to put all our eggs in the negotiation baskets. We're not going to put all our eggs in the UN baskets. We're going to take the struggle onto the streets, into communities, going after our banks where we put our money in, who are lending to fossil fuel companies and so on. So we're going to open up a whole range of other struggles that have been going on, including strategic litigation in Philippines right now. The Philippine Human Rights Council is started a legal process to go after the top fossil fuel companies to hold them accountable.
University of California entire system just divested.
Yes, and then of course the divestment. You know, we had a conference in Cape Town just last week to look at where the divestment movement were, and we completely overshot the target in terms of, we were hoping for 10 trillion. We're already at 11 plus trillion with months to go. And we think people are beginning to see that they have power. Even if we have little money in a bank account, we might have quite a lot of power to put pressure on the banks, and those that have money to invest should be pulling out their money and putting it into clean energy if they care about the children and their children's futures.
Kumi Naidoo, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Secretary General of Amnesty International, previously head of Greenpeace, lifelong South African human rights and climate justice activist. When we come back, we go to Gambia, where an ongoing Public Truth and Reconciliation Commission is investigating atrocities of the former dictator, Yahya Jammeh. We'll speak with a Gambian beauty queen who's publicly accused Jammeh of rape. Stay with us.
Sister of my tears, sister of my cries, hand in hand we stand as one. We push, we reach, we rise, we rise, we rise. We rise, hand in hand we stand as one. We push, we reach, we rise. Sister of my tears, sister of my cries, hand in hand we stand as one. We push, we reach, we rise. We rise, we rise, we rise. Hand in hand we stand as one. We push, we reach, we rise. A mother's strength, a daughter's love, a sister's will that will be done. Our voices raised together will do the work of 1,000,000 guns. Sister of my blood, sister of my heart, although the miles may separate us, we can't stand apart, 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 apart. Although the miles may separate us, we can't stand apart. Steel tempered in the fire of fear, strength tested in the dark of hate. We had it in us all along. It is and never won't be too late.
We Rise by Rhiannon Giddens. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to Gambia, where an ongoing Public Truth and Reconciliation Commission is investigating the atrocities of former President Yahya Jammeh, who ruled the West African country of 2 million people for 22 years before his regime ended in 2017. During the hearings, members of Jammeh's death squad have admitted to killing migrants, journalists and civilians during the president's reign. Survivors of the regime have also testified during the hearings, which have been live-streamed across the country. The investigation is part of an ongoing process to reckon with the horrors committed during Jammeh's rule, including killing and disappearing hundreds of people, torture, unjustified jailings, and sexual violence against women and girls. But the perpetrators of this violence have never been brought to justice, including Jammeh himself, who fled to Equatorial Guinea in 2017 after losing the 2016 presidential election. He refused to cede power for weeks before leaders in the region helped arrange his exile.
Among those demanding Jammeh be tried in criminal court for his crimes is a Gambian beauty queen who says the president raped her when she was 18. Fatou Jallow, known as Tufa, has become a leading voice against the former president. In this Human Rights Watch video, she tells her story.
I can't wait to face Yahya Jammeh. I was 18 years old when he raped me in 2015. I've spent the last 4 years wanting to erase, to hide that it didn't happen. Like, life is all good. It happened. He is no longer the president. My family is fine. Life goes on. That's pretty easy, right? I wish that is what it was. The pageant is a competition of women empowerment. So the messaging behind it was to empower women, to give them a platform to compete and talk about issues that affect their communities, and also have a scholarship for girls so they can go and study abroad and come back to the country and contribute.
And the winner is Fatou Jallow from Gambia Talent.
Wow! I was so proud of myself. I am a crowned queen, right? And I'm going to study abroad. My first time meeting the ex-president was in 2014. Towards the end of the year after the pageant, we were invited to the State House.
Jammeh used state channels to pressure women to visit him and work for him. He abused many of them. He began reaching out to Tufe, claiming an interest in her community service project.
One day he asked that he wanted to marry me. But I told him I'm not planning to. I don't want to get married. I want to go and study. That's the reason why I got into this pageant.
A few weeks later, Jammeh invited Tufe back to the State House.
In his eyes, all I saw was just a sense of anger at the fact that I would have the audacity somehow to say no to him. The president, he did what he wanted to do, and I was screaming, and at some point I couldn't hear my scream anymore. And he told me no one is gonna hear me anyways. Well, I'm gonna say this story again, and I'm gonna own this story.
Tufe has decided to tell her story to the Gambian Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission. The commission can recommend that Jammeh be prosecuted.
My justice, most importantly, includes a whole system change so that we can prosecute these men, have our day in court. Nobody discusses rape. And yes, I am scared. I am scared. But I want the next person after me to be a little less scared than me.
That's Fatou Jallow, known as Tufa. 2 other women have also come forward to accuse the former president of Gambia of rape and sexual assault. Human Rights Watch says Yahya Jammeh, quote, hand-picked women and girls to rape or sexually assault while president, requiring so-called protocol girls to be on call for sex. He denies the claims. Well, Tufe joins us now in our New York studio, along with attorney Reed Brody of Human Rights Watch, who's currently leading the prosecution of the former Gambian dictator, Yahya Jammeh. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Tufa, your bravery is, is unbelievable, what you went through. We didn't want you to have to describe this again, your assault, but this is only a part of the story. You then had to escape from Gambia. Explain what happened next.
Thank you for having me. Leaving the country was very prompt. It happened a week after the incident, and because I received a call again from a protocol officer to go back to some event, and I realized that it's not a life I would want to live, to be just called and picked up by the president at any time that he wanted. I remember waking up in the morning and deciding to go to the market. I put on the niqab, which is the Muslim attire that only my face or eyes would show, and I put the passport just right by my waist, and I walked to the market to do grocery shopping. And when I realized that whoever is following me at this point is convinced that I'm actually buying groceries, I jumped into a cab that was going to the capital, where you had to cross a border to get to the other side of the border into Senegal. I got onto a boat, a fishing boat, because I couldn't take the ferry. I crossed with the boat, and then right at the border, I realized I couldn't take the formal route because I had to show paperwork. I joined in a big truck that carried livestock like cows and goats, and I squeezed in between two guys in the front seat of the truck, and that's how I found myself in Senegal.
And can you talk about, we mentioned this briefly, and you've just said again that you fled in part, obviously, because you were called again by a protocol officer to go back. Who were these protocol girls? Why are they called protocol girls? And the fact that after you came out with your own story, the government actually asked for other people to come and testify as well about their experiences. Right. So can you talk about whether you met these other girls who were also assaulted by the former president, and the women who've come forward after you've spoken out?
Right. The protocol girls, their role was very nuanced and very unclear to the rest of the population, but they were girls that worked at the State House to do paperwork or have guests. The
State House is where he lives, or lived?
Where he lived. That is the State
House.
Office and the Presidential Palace.
Mm-hmm. And that's where he raped you.
That's where the incident happened, yeah. And the protocol girls did work there, and one of them in particular, called Jimbi Jammeh, was the one who kept in contact with me and invited me to these events, and also tried to get as close to me as she can. The rest of the other girls, I wasn't very well known to them, or I didn't know them because we didn't interact a lot. Some of the other girls that I've met, like as we can see in the report, there are 2 other women that accuse him, but they have decided to remain anonymous. I have met one of them, and I've met other women in private, but again, within the culture that we live in, rape is not something you want to own publicly.
What gave you the courage to say your name?
Because it's my story, because it's my truth, and nobody can tell it better than I can, and it's time for someone to own it. It's time for someone to start the conversation. I did not want to be part of the people that would protect my perpetrator, who I believe have done it to so many other people. Knowing the consequences of it, I wanted to say my name because there are faces and actual human beings behind these stories.
You charged the former dictator with rape?
I charged him with rape.
And the other 2 women whom you mentioned, are they still in the Gambia?
One is not, one is, yeah.
Now, this is all part of the being raised in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I wanted to turn to Sergeant Omar Jallow, a member of the Junglers, Yahya Jammeh's elite hit squad. During Gambia's Truth, Reconciliation, Reparations Commission, Jallow testified on the killing of 56 West African migrants in 2005.
When we arrived at the ground, Solo said these people are mercenaries. The order from the head of state, the former president, Yahya Jammeh, is they are all to be executed.
So that's Sergeant Omar Jallow, no relation to Tufa. Reed Brody, I wanted to bring you into this conversation right now. Put this story, I mean, Tufa is astounding in her bravery and the wherewithal to escape the country and then to speak out. And you're planning to return.
Planning to return next month to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Put Gambia in a geopolitical context, where it is, Reed, and the significance of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what it took to get to this point.
Yahya Jammeh was the ruler of Gambia for 22 years. Gambia is a tiny country, almost totally surrounded by Senegal, with the exception of its Atlantic, 60-mile Atlantic front. Yahya Jammeh lost an election. He first accepted the results, then refused to accept them. And he only left the country after Gambians actually rose up in a Gambia has decided movement. And other West African countries who were fed up with Yahya Jammeh, fed up with his interference with rebels in Senegal, landmines in Senegal, drug trafficking, corruption, forced him to step down 2 years ago. And then the government decided to establish this landmark Truth Commission, which is, it's like a soap opera. I mean, people are coming, as you saw, on live TV. I mean, you get into a taxi, you go to a home, and people are watching these people testify. They're going to have a special hearing on sexual violence next month where Tufa will testify. As you mentioned in our report, we showed that Jammeh had an entire system of bringing women to his office to visit him. He would see women in crowds and tell his assistants to bring them to, and then he sexually abused them. But we're also hearing witness after witness, Jammeh's own hitmen confessing to having participated on Jammeh's orders in the killing of distinguished journalist and editor Data Haidara, in the killing of 2 Gambian American citizens who were ordered to be and who were chopped to pieces.
Let's go to a bit more of the testimony to Staff Sergeant Amadou Badji, another member of the so-called Junglers, which was the name for Yahya Jammeh's elite hit squad during Gambia's Truth Commission. He testified on the killing of 2 Gambian Americans.
Yahya Jammeh said, let's kill these people and cut off and cut their flesh into pieces.
Cut them up into pieces.
Cut them up into pieces.
Like they would do meat.
Again,
Exactly.
This is broadcasting live throughout Gambia.
That's right. And people are watching this. People are. This is the topic of conversation in the Gambia, and also in Ghana. Interestingly, the 56 migrants who were assassinated, these were 56 West African migrants who were trying to get to Europe. Their canoe was beached in the Gambia. They were all arrested, and 55 of them were killed. One of them escaped to tell the tale. And because of him, we are able to see that the Junglers killed not just Gambians, but 44 people from Ghana, 9 people from Nigeria, Togo, Ivory Coast, Senegal. So Jammeh is accused not just of murdering Gambian citizens, not just of raping Gambian citizens, but also murdering the citizens of 5 other West African countries. So now Jammeh is in Equatorial Guinea, which, as you know, Amy, is one of the long-standing dictatorships in Africa. As part of the deal to finally get his troops were coming in, as the Gambian people were surrounding and trying to get him out, he fled to Equatorial Guinea, which is been ruled for over 40 years by Teodoro Obiang, and who has vowed to protect Yahya Jammeh. So we're hoping that the testimony of people like Tufa, the testimonies at the Truth Commission, the testimonies of the victims are going to build a political will so that all of Africa, all of West Africa comes together to request that Yahya Jammeh be delivered to justice.
And Tufa, you are going to testify next month against Jammeh as part of the Truth Commission. Talk about what you're going to say.
First of all, I want to be at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because I want the issue of sexual assault to be part of what we write as a history, what we recount as a history. I'm going to talk about my story and the stories of other women and the 2 women that are also in the report to put a face to the atrocities that have been committed on Gambian women. You know, sometimes it is often forgotten how the women populace have really suffered under Yahya Jammeh, how we were used as pawns and tools politically and in the bedroom and in the State House, like the protocol girls themselves. Sometimes I see them as victims because they were used as a machine for Yahya Jammeh. We were used to vote for him. We were not given the opportunity to actually take important roles in the society. So I wish to be there to express these sentiments and to tell my story the way it is, to make it a national conversation.
I want to thank you so much for both being with us. We're going to do part 2 of this conversation, and we're going to post it online at democracynow.org. Tufa Jallow is a Gambian feminist and anti-rape activist returning to Gambia to tell her story. She's taken refuge in Toronto, Canada. Reed Brody, known as the Dictator Hunter, is a counsel and spokesperson for Human Rights Watch. He is currently leading the prosecution of the ex-president, Yahya Jammeh. That does it for our broadcast. Tomorrow's now produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.